because I keep coming back to no one asks for a colostomy bag if they don't need a colostomy bag, right? Like, no one asks for...
If you don't know what a colostomy bag is, you can
Google it. Yeah.
Welcome to the Disability Rights Montana podcast. My name is Kona.
And I'm David.
And today we are going to talk a little bit about the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability. And we'll define them, talk about where they're used, how they're used, why they're used, and our perspectives on their use in our society, our world, our workplace, all those places. So let's start with defining them.
Sure.
So I don't know if you want to start, David. Do we want to start with the social model or the medical model?
Well, how about, I don't know, I think about it as, you want to use like fancy words, epistemologies. Like there's lots of ways of knowing about things. You can make art about things. You can write poems about things. You can write scientific articles about things. And it may all be the same sunset, but you're going to perceive it differently. So you can talk about, think about, act in a way that sees disability as a medical function. You can see it as a way of being present in a society with other people. You can see it as a moral thing. There's a moral construct of disability. There's a civil rights construct of disability. So, but a lot of the big ones that we bump into a lot are medical and social. And I think what most people in our culture, the dominant model of people walking around, think about disability as a medical thing.
In our culture, we're talking in this sense, American culture.
Sure. Yep. That's what I'm familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And that's what I'm familiar with as well. Other cultures outside of America might probably do view disability in a different lens. Obviously, they have different laws in different countries, but for us here today, the United States, that's the lens.
You got me thinking, so we need to have another podcast where we have an anthropologist who looks at disability come talk to us about different ways humans around the world think about disability, and maybe a comparative law analysis of maybe someone to come in and talk about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and what did it take to pull that together, and what do people in this country think about disability versus people in this country versus how America looks at disability from a legal standpoint. So, I don't know about those things, but I'd love to interview somebody about that.
That would be great.
Yeah.
But in our country, when we talk about, we all live in a society, we have social structures. We also have the development of people throughout time, specifically technology and medicine throughout time. In the early 1900s, it may have been quite the technological feat to have a blood transfusion, if that's even possible. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I don't know if that happened back then, but now it seems like that's almost a standard thing that can happen at any time. Or us, I go to the doctor, and my doctor, my yearly annual checkup, and we draw blood to do a complete blood count. And they, that's a very standard thing where, 100 years ago, maybe that wasn't a standard thing. And so the medical model of what a disability is, or how medicine looks at disability, has certainly changed with technology, has certainly changed with what's available. Do you think it's gotten better over time?
Well, I guess that's an interesting way of phrasing, because I often approach that, has it gotten better over time, through sort of a technological way of looking at disability. People are like, oh, isn't it amazing? We have this new technology that allows X to happen, someone to move around in this way, or someone to digest information in that way. And a lot of that stuff's really cool. Like, there are some technological advances, there are medical advances, but no amount of medical advances will address the ableism, or the discrimination, the stigma, the othering, the oppression of people with disabilities. That isn't necessarily a medical medically solvable thing. So if you think about what is medicine good at, you talked about like, oh, well, we can do blood transfusions now. We have vaccinations and we have surgeries that we can do now to address different conditions, which are great. They keep people alive. Maybe we have more people with disabilities now because they would have died before if not for these interventions. I certainly wasn't anticipated to live beyond infancy with how I was born, how my heart worked, but I had open heart surgery and I lived. And so now I live with a heart that doesn't work the way everyone else's heart works, but it's better than being dead with a heart that doesn't work like everybody else's heart works. So that's that medicine provided, right? But what is medicine good at? Diagnose, treat. What does treat mean? Usually eradicate. It's
Could
let
it
me get
also
rid of this.
could it
or
also
that.
mean fix? That seems to be what typically when I go to the doctor, I think, oh, okay, how do I fix this?
I think fix sounds too positive universally. Sometimes a fix, I think, again, I'm just talking for myself. I'm not talking for the disability community. Is I would like to eradicate things that will kill me. But I don't need you to eradicate my dyslexia. I'm good with it. Help me ameliorate it, mitigate it, figure out ways to work with it within the society we have that really loves the written word and processing information in a particular way. But I don't need you to fix that. I like how my brain works.
Because the word fix ultimately means toward what, right?
Right.
Like
And
what are we
away from what? Like, I'm not defective. I just work differently than a lot of other folks.
and that binary way of looking at it's good or bad. And maybe I said earlier, is it better now? And that's probably still not the best way to think, like, is living with a disability better now than it was 100 years ago? I mean, maybe I could arguably say
I mean,
yes.
I like having like hand sanitizer easily available and like disease rates down, except when we're not in a global pandemic and currently having a resurgence of this virulent virus. Like, is it better? We have ways of responding to disease that help people live. Sure, I think people have more options, but I don't think the measure would be how many people are fixed or how many, like, for some things, yes, I want this to go away. Other things, not so much. My existence doesn't need to be, quote, fixed.
So here we're not trying to define. I mean, it would be very difficult to define what is fixed, what is better.
For us, because I don't know, I'm a little scared of what that means. And again, have another episode just on eugenics.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think if you're in a treatment-oriented profession, like a doctor, a nurse, a therapist of some sort, occupational therapist or talk therapist, you are trained to fix. You are trained, this is bad, not having this would be good. And this is how we approach eradicating the cause or at least the symptoms of X way of being in the world. That's a very different way of approaching if I exist this way in the world, how do I get the rest of the world to appreciate what I have to offer? How do I go through the world in a way that makes the most out of my existence and everyone else around me? And I can't control all of that, but I can do some work. And that's where I dedicate my time. A lot of folks dedicate their time to trying to make some social changes, some structural process changes in the world that better take advantage of the various gifts that people have to bring to the world, and don't expect them to change, but say we should be changing because we haven't ever really taken advantage of how this person presents, or we don't know all the values this person has. So we as a society, we as systems that interact with people, whether it's employers or education systems or medical systems or government systems, court systems, how do those need to change in order to better allow people with disabilities to access them, to benefit from them, and to provide the benefits they have to offer to them? So that's an entirely different way of thinking about it than sit down with a doctor for 6 minutes. They say, you got this. This is the course of treatment. We're going to try to eradicate, lessen, ameliorate. We're going to try to tamp down your existence. Sometimes that is what an individual wants, needs. Other times, they just want to be themselves and want the rest of the world to stop getting in the way of that and actually maybe embrace it a bit once in a while. What would that look like to live in a world where, you know, getting around the world because, you know, by walking or riding a bike because you can't drive because of your vision, or you can't drive because you aren't fully employed and can't afford a car because of your disability, that's a perfectly acceptable way of getting around the world. But if you live in New York City, that's easy. It's the preferred method of getting around. If you live out here in Montana, you can't walk everywhere you need to get to. It's a driver-centric world. So we can see that depending on where you live and how the structure is designed, you're more or less disabled. And if there are steps to get into a building, well, then you can't use a wheelchair to get into the building. Sure, you could design wheelchairs that go upstairs, but you could also just not put the steps there. Or anyone can use a ramp. Only people who are walking can use steps. So why are we favoring steps over something everyone can use? So that is a social response, not a technological or medical response to a condition that you would define disabling when steps exist.
So in that explanation, we have moved a bit from talking about medical, or kind of shifting toward what is that social modality of disability. And it sounds like, I mean, as both you and I know, it's not based on a book. It's not based on a diagnosis that another person gives you. It's based on how an individual moves in an environment, or I should say interacts with an environment, and that interaction being either stifled or allowed or supported, I should say, to the best of our ability as people, as a community.
Yeah. And it recognizes the both positive and negative potential power that the environment you're in has, and that's an important aspect to what is a disability. If you live in a world that accepts all sorts of different ways of being, like this week we gave me a spinny chair, and like, so I can fidget a bit and get some of my energy out, and I don't have to divert some of my mental energy to don't fidget, because that's what it takes. I gotta think about don't fidget.
And if you're just listening to the audio of this, you'll never even know.
Right, so. Exactly. And so that's another thing. Is like, I don't know. And there are going to be some people who are watching this thing like, damn, like, stop fidgeting. That's distracting. I'm sorry. I mean, like, I'm also not better looking. Like this, if you're watching, this is what you get.
And you don't, and just to back up there, you don't need to apologize for that either.
Right.
Because it's just, and that's, I think, part of that. And
so, no, I'm really not sorry. I was being sarcastic there.
But that's kind of the part of moving from a medical model to a social model, is that based on medicine, I may have this certain label, but that label comes with, I think you said this earlier, it can come with stigma. It comes with weight. And it's like, well, I have this label. I am now a burden in some way.
Right.
But the question is, like, are you really? Like, are you really? And why? Why are you a burden? Well, because who's telling you you're a burden?
Yeah. And it's presumed that there's something about me that is wrong, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be ameliorated. That itself is burdensome, right? And I think that's a really important aspect. I was talking to someone else earlier this week about how do we invite people into the disability community? Like, there isn't a real smooth way that we do that, right? Like, when did you learn about the social model of disability? It wouldn't have been from a doctor or a nurse. They would have introduced you to the medical model of disability. And that's usually the first person who introduces someone to a physical or mental difference in how, like, someone is recognizing, oh, you present differently than most of my patients who are in the middle of that bell curve, you know, or I, as a clinician, am seeing something that is different here. And so I'm going to raise that to you. That may be the first time you consider the label disability.
And in
but
that,
that's not where the disability community comes at it from.
yeah, and in that medical model, you're talking about like, well, when people enter, and you can enter at any point. You mentioned you when you were younger, much younger.
Yeah.
You had, baby
From
is that
day
in-
from day
day
one.
one.
Yeah, yeah.
That's and that is a traumatic way to enter the world. I would, and not just for you, but
I don't
for
know. I was there, but not really conscious.
but potentially
Right, yeah,
like for
yeah.
your support system. That's
Yeah,
that's not
yeah.
an easy thing to deal with in terms of a congenital heart
Yeah.
defect, if you want to use the word defect. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's a
I don't
word you
know.
would use.
It is the clinical term,
uh,
right? But I talk about like I can't walk that much. I can walk, but like I can't hike like my wife can hike.
So you can enter from day one.
Yeah.
But also you can enter day 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. In a medical sense, it can often be a traumatic entrance. Can you think of, in a medical sense, when you're talking about disability, is there a non-traumatic way to enter that conversation?
Well, I think there are ways that we could make it better for folks, but no, it's tough. I've never heard of somebody who's kind of like, you know what? I had this really supportive, really cool doctor, and she explained to me that like this is not a bad thing. It's just a different thing, and people who operate this way. And I'm honestly, now that I'm talking about it out loud, I guess I've seen really cool stuff on TikTok where there are therapists with ADHD or therapists with dyslexia or therapists with the condition that they're providing therapy around who make it a point of not putting like there's something wrong with you, you need to change, but rather, hey, I've been through this and I know when you're going to school, they're going to expect you to sit there. You don't get a spinny chair and you're going to have to read and you're going to have to read out loud. Now, what do? I knew as a kid, like, okay, I got to read out loud. I'm going to count how many people are in front of me. Each one has to read a paragraph or a sentence. I'm going to count those sentences. I'm just going to practice this one over and over. I never heard any words that came out before this. And if I miscounted, I'm screwed. But because there's just such anxiety about reading out loud. As an example, like I found my own coping mechanisms throughout school. I wish I had learned them earlier. So having therapists who have that lived experience, maybe that is one of the answers of, well, yes, there's a bit of a medical model here, but they get that it's not immutable or intrinsic to you, that it is a problem of the environment we're expecting you to interface with. So I'm going to give you some tips. And
you just had, in that example you just gave about counting speakers down in class and being like, oh, this is where I come in. Water finds the path of least resistance. The disability community have a lot of ingenuity in figuring out, all right, how do I get through this social situation that is going to be going to be least traumatic for me? I mean, that's really what I'm hearing in that example was like, how do I just get through this next step? And it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a short timeline, and how do we extend that timeline to not just say, well, how do I get through this class? It's how do I get through this school year or this job interview, or how do I plan further out? And I feel like society historically has made that difficult because so many systems are set up based on the medical model, whether that's getting an accommodation, whether that's, just so many, getting an IEP. Like there's like, you got this idea of documentation.
Well, and that, so earlier I talked about there's lots of ways of looking at it. We've been talking mainly about medical and social, but let me add in moral. Like there's a moral aspect to how people look at disability. And I think that's where maybe some of the medical stuff gets bootstrapped into the moral part of, let me give you a scenario. You're a policymaker. You're a mile or two up the road at the state capitol, right? And you've been elected to office, and you are on a committee that's trying to decide which of these two programs do we fund. And one program is for birth through 3 kids who have received services around developmental disabilities, and they need more services for intellectual disabilities they were born with. And then you've got another program for 18 to 21-year-olds who have similar support needs, but have been in car accidents because they were drunk drivers. And you have to decide where you're going to put your money. Now, we could place bets. Which one is going to get more of the bucket of money? Is it going to be the little babies with intellectual disabilities, or those teens who are drunk driving and created their own disabilities? We are all human beings, right? And we're thinking through, what would we do? And you might have that, oh, I don't really like the answer I gave, or I think I got a great answer. But whatever it is, you know there's a moral component to that. Someone is overlaying, these people deserve it more than these people. And so if we back up, how did the medical model even get into our civil rights laws? It goes back to, I'd mentioned this in another podcast we did, where it goes back to the Civil War. We had Union soldiers returning, and the federal government, for the first time, wanted to create a disability-related program. They created a program for folks who couldn't go back to the farm and keep working because they lost a leg. And so they're like, okay, we'll give you some disability benefits and a pension for disabled vets. But what if they're faking? So we're inserting morality into this, that there are going to be these people who see free money out there, and they're going to lie about being a Union soldier who had their leg cut off. I don't know, how you're going to do that, but they said, well, doctor got to check them out, make sure that their leg actually was amputated on the battlefield, or we'll check their arm, that they have, nerve damage and they can't lift their arm up anymore. Didn't really cover mental health related stuff well, and we know that war does a lot more damage than just what's done physically. It does a lot of that damage, and it does a lot of damage to how people process trauma. Can also create traumatic brain injuries. And so it was really just have a doctor check them out, sign off. They really have. And so that's what we built into the legal system, was doctors. Doctors will catch the immoral liars. And that is still with us.
Yeah.
You have to jump through so many hoops.
I mean, right now, during Medicaid unwinding,
Yeah.
I mean, like, what do you think there was a long wait time for getting a doctor in the Civil War to check you out?
Right. And what was the state of medicine back then? Yeah, sure, they could confirm your leg was gone.
Yeah.
But could they run an EEG and see how your brain is working now? Absolutely not. So it's not like that's the gold standard and they know everything. And so let's just go to these omniscient medical professionals and they will sort it all out for us.
Is that fair? Like, is that something a doctor signed up for in terms of, and I don't know, I'm not a doctor. If you're a doctor, like, let us know.
Right. You're
but,
in these scenarios where someone's trying to
like,
explain, this is what I need, and you're being asked to fill out paperwork. I'd love to interview someone.
Yeah, like, what is that? Is that a fair assumption of the job? Like, there's a process. I need a piece of paper. And this brings up a whole nother question of just the access to healthcare. Yeah. So, like, great, there's a medical model. We know what that is. Great, there's a social model. We know what that is. But those also, everyone is in the social model. But when we talk about the medical model, if you don't have access to healthcare, then you don't even get that diagnosis. Right. You don't even get that piece of paper. And there may be people who have been in a situation, I'm sure there have been, where what you just described, someone faking it.
Yeah.
And that's a
situation they'd say, I'd love for medical people to diagnose and offer some treatment. Like, and I get that. That is, I'm not trying to criticize. If somebody wants treatment for something, great.
Individual choice is always there.
Yeah. And what we're talking about is the way that society conceptualizes the concept of disability. Yeah. And is the concept gatekept by the medical profession? Is the concept defined around something that is broken and needs to be fixed? Or is the concept defined around society works for some people and not for others? I think we can agree. It works for rich people.
Yep.
It works for white people.
Agreed.
It works for men.
Agreed.
It works for peoples whose brains and bodies work in a particular narrow band that medicine has said this is the right way. Now, is it fair to put that on medicine? As we talked about, not really, because policymakers look to medicine, like society looks to medicine to arbitrate what is or is not quote unquote normal.
And also just along those lines, you know, the what I would maybe consider a misstep or mistake or an uninformed decision of a past person certainly does not mean that someone in that profession currently has that. I mean, they have there's that history, but the provider right now in January 2024 is certainly far removed from the Civil War times.
Sure.
And has a total different knowledge set and skill set. But is that history still there? We still are requiring, in certain scenarios, doctors or medical professionals to sign off to say, yep, this person meets this disability requirement. Check. Now you can go apply for health insurance, or you can, get your accommodation at school. Fill out that IEP appropriately, and that it takes a lot of knowledge to become a doctor. It takes a lot of perseverance. It takes a lot of time, and people are very passionate about that. And when you're in these other scenarios of, say, like an IEP meeting, people look at those letters at the end of someone's name, and that does have weight. I mean, those people went to school, they really studied hard, they got to where they want, and they're pursuing probably a very specific area of medicine. But when you just have that piece of paper in that meeting, in that IEP meeting, it's hard to know what that whole conversation was. And so in these other meetings now, they really are depending on like what those few sentences or that checkbox, and it doesn't really go beyond that. Is that a benefit to the system we live in? Is it a con? Like, there's a lot of other processes that require certification, if you want to use that word. But is there a benefit to having the medical model of disability, I guess?
Well, I think you kind of see that a little bit in insurance, where Medicaid will cover a treatment but not diagnosis. And so what you were just describing is just checking the box. Do the assessment to see, does the person have it? That's a threshold matter that needs to be done to get access to some benefit. Then there's an entirely different question. Well, what would actually help the person? What does the person want and need? And it'd be great if there were as much focus put on that, and we were a little less concerned about the gatekeeping or the initial threshold question, because I keep coming back to, no one asks for a colostomy bag if they don't need a colostomy bag, right? Like, no one asks for...
If you don't know what a colostomy bag is, you can
Google
it.
Yeah. There are just so many people cutting across all socioeconomic categories, all races, all genders. Disability exists. It is everywhere. And once we start recognizing that as a community, we do better when we work together. We do better when we recognize that our struggles are related to the struggles against racism, against poverty-based discrimination, and against sexist-based discrimination. And we are collectively all working towards removing all of these social structures that keep certain people separated from power, certain people separated from just being able to exist in a way that
as
is
a
authentic
community,
to themselves with other people. Right.
Working toward what you're describing as collective liberation.
Right.
And
that's where the social model starts to really connect with other folks, is how does my body exist? How does my brain exist in a way that someone in power doesn't like? And so then you think, okay, what is different? How do we change some of those structures so that we can be deconstructing the big R racism, the big A ableism in these types of settings? And what is different here? How does that work out differently? What can we learn from this place that does this differently? What can we learn from that? So we also sometimes talk about like employment, and we have another podcast that you can check out where we're talking about how do you talk about your disability at work. And one of the things I mentioned was find someone that you can trust, that you feel safe with, that you can talk through some of the stuff before you start talking to people who have the power to discriminate against you. And that's a similar idea of, there are some places that are going to be safer. No in particular place is 100% safe, but there are going to be some places that are safer to have a disability of one sort or another, and some places that are going to be less safe. So what is it about the safer places that we can learn from and then start systematizing across multiple other environments? So back to your question of how do we do this? It's one piece at a time. It's learning what worked here that made Disability Rights Montana a safer place to come out about a disability than some other generic employer that we're not going to create some bad employer, but you can all picture bad employer in your head versus good employer. DRM's an awesome employer. And so what can we learn from DRM and use over here? And what can we learn from an employer who's really great at addressing racism in their company?
And what can we then, as DRM, learn to do that here?
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
how can we partner in that way and collectively grow as a society? So
that's that social change. It requires collective liberation to do big social change. But when you realize, oh, that's really big work, but then we get to borrow from all the experts in the field, like there are people already working on all of these issues. It's just a matter of being open and saying, I have something to learn from you. Can I, educate myself? It's not your job to teach me everything, but it is my job to recognize you have something to teach and start trying to digest that.
it's certainly my individual responsibility to question and realize,
Yes.
there's something here I need to learn.
So those questions you were talking about, like, oh, why are we doing this? That's exactly what each person needs to be doing. And then trying to go find answers and then bringing your best shot at making that social change, whether it's in your employer or your family or your friend group or your church or whatever your social circle is, or your sphere of influence, as I sometimes think about it. Then bring those thoughts, those conversations, those questions, those resources to that space and say, we could be a space that is good at deconstructing what we've always done. That's the way we've always done it, and do it in a better way. And that is harnessing the power of thinking about disability as a social model. What's the benefit of that? It's not just purely an academic exercise. It means then what we do to make life better for people with disabilities is to change the structures that are treating them poorly. That's better than sending everybody to a doctor to get whatever treatment might need it. Again, people may want treatment for different things. I'm not saying that, but I'm also saying people don't need to be fixed.
It's not the only route.
Yeah.
And people don't need to be fixed.
Yeah.
I think that's a great spot to wrap up here. If anyone listening has experience in any of these areas we talked about, if you want to let us know when you learned about the social model of disability, when you learned about the medical model, if this is new to you, let us know. If you have questions about it, just put them in the comments below and we'll get back to you. So, thanks for the conversation. This is great. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.